Aviation has an uncanny ability to both make news and be part of the news. It's almost always interwoven with modern history's most consequential events. So this year, for our last video of the year, we're covering the most consequential, influential, important, or interesting flights of 2024. And perhaps the year's most dramatic incident happened just 2 days in. On January 2nd, Japan Airlines Flight 516, flown by an Airbus A350-900 carrying 367 passengers and 12 crew members, struck a Japanese Coast Guard Dash 8 at Tokyo's Haneda Airport, killing 5 of the 6 service members aboard the military aircraft. While the Airbus was legitimately cleared for landing, the Coast Guard plane, gearing up to deliver supplies for victims of the Noto earthquake, seemingly taxied onto the runway without permission, and the Airbus struck it as it came down. This marked the first full hull loss for the A350 aircraft type after it was engulfed in flames. The horrific accident kicked off a spate of high-profile near misses and runway incursions early in 2024. The public took note as flight safety peaked as a Google search term for the first time since 2014. The news media fed into this, covering even minor events that happen regularly, but it was more feeling than fact. Thousands of runway incursion incidents happen around the world every year, and in the vast majority of cases, they're noticed before turning into a crash. In the US at least, the figures show that the number in 2024 actually represents a notable decline from 2023's totals. In fact, the number of incursions per million takeoffs and landings is the second lowest in a decade, beaten only by COVID-affected 2020. The decrease in close calls is attributed to a number of factors, including improved systems and alert tools, investments in runway infrastructure, and the improvement of air traffic control staffing levels. But perhaps the most consequential flight of the entire year happened just 3 days later when a door plug on Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 from Portland, Oregon to Ontario, California blew off a Boeing 737 MAX 9 16,000 feet in the air. Even for those not focused on aviation news, this was, and remains, one of the biggest stories of the year. But not so much for the incident itself. While undoubtedly terrifying, it only resulted in 3 minor injuries. The fallout of the incident, however, has been massive for Boeing and for the entire aviation industry. It started with the immediate halts, which grounded 171 Boeing 737 MAX 9s around the world and lasted 3 weeks as they underwent inspections. But the snowball effect from this event continues to gather mass even today, after investigations found systematic production quality issues within the company that prioritized speed over safety. This has been financially ruinous for the company, as production on the cash cow 737 line has slowed, pushing the key production milestone of 42 737 MAXs per month from September 2024 to March 2025. Since the January 5th incident, the stock has remained down about 30% as investors have lost confidence in the company's prospects. Boeing is the United States' single largest exporter, contributing more than $1 trillion to the US economy and affecting more than 5 million jobs. So ultimately, it's not just about plane doors, but tentacles of industry connections with effects that still can't be measured, including a heightened fear of flying on Boeing aircraft from the public. But not all of the most noteworthy flights are those that go wrong. It was the year of Taylor Swift, and nothing could more appropriately capture the world's obsession with the pop star than its intense tracking of a private jet that traveled 5,473 miles from Tokyo's Haneda Airport to LAX. Since even before her boyfriend's team, the Kansas City Chiefs, had earned the right to play in the Super Bowl, fans had been analyzing whether the pop star would be able to physically make it from her February 10th Tokyo tour date to the Super Bowl, scheduled for the very next day. The conclusion was yes, if she was quick, thanks to the international dateline. So when the day arose, she hopped aboard a flight nicknamed the Football Era, a 3-cabin Bombardier Global 6000 VistaJet charter flight that delivered her to LAX on January 10th at 3:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. That's where her own 19-passenger Dassault Falcon 7X, which could not comfortably make it from Tokyo to Las Vegas without stopping for fuel, was waiting so she could take a second flight to her ultimate destination, Las Vegas, where Kelsey and the Chiefs were playing. But like with anything Swift associated, there was fallout. That's because she and other celebrities such as Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg didn't necessarily like all their movements being tracked by online sleuths. Swift went as far as to threaten a lawsuit against college student Jack Sweeney, who had set up a Twitter account following her flights to draw attention to her carbon footprint, at one point dubbed the highest of any celebrity in the world. The timing of her protest was serendipitous, as Congress had already introduced a provision in the FAA reauthorization bill that made it possible to hide private jet ownership by request. While it's still possible to track down ownership by investigation, the skies for Swift & Company got more secretive with this year's legislation. Up north, Canadian airline Lynx Air took its final flight from Calgary to Toronto on February 25th. A few days prior, it had announced it would cease all operations due to financial difficulties, marking the latest of quite a few low-cost carriers to shut down in the country. Lynx began flying in April 2022 with 9 Boeing 737 MAX 8s serving these destinations in North America. Despite carrying over 2 million passengers, Lynx couldn't overcome the compounding challenges of budget airline operations in Canada, citing rising fuel, capital, and regulatory costs, along with inflationary and exchange rate challenges. While US-based low-cost carriers have struggled with similar issues lately, particularly rising operational costs and interest rates, Canada's market presents additional challenges that make its low-cost airlines even more prone to bankruptcy. Canada's airports are operated as non-profits owned by the government, which restricts their funding to 3 sources: aeronautical fees, or landing and terminal fees, non-aeronautical fees for businesses that operate within airports, and airport improvement fees. Unlike US airports, Canadian airports receive no federal government subsidies and are managed by local authorities. But simultaneously, Canadian airports pay substantial rents to the federal government, who still technically owns them. That means individual airports must fund their own improvements and operating expenses, which has made Canada's landing fees and airport infrastructure costs some of the highest in the world. Operating in this Sisyphean market means that low-cost carriers are paying more than counterparts in the US or Europe just to operate. This has consequences for consumers, as Canada's domestic air market is effectively a duopoly still dominated by Air Canada and WestJet. Without low-cost competition, there is little market pressure to keep prices competitive for consumers. On March 7th, a Boeing 777-200ER headed for Osaka lost a tire on takeoff from San Francisco, prompting an emergency diversion to LAX. The tire crushed a car in San Francisco's employee parking lot, although nobody was injured. Initial reports questioned Boeing's manufacturing process, given their recent track record, but the 777-200 involved was a 15-year-old model that may have instead suffered from United's own maintenance procedures. The media responded sharply to this incident, reporting on a string of other minor incidents like a missing external panel on one aircraft and another rolling onto the grass in Houston, to paint a narrative of a lax safety culture at the airline, and perhaps in response, the Federal Aviation Administration began a safety probe into United's work processes, manuals, and facilities. This process paused FAA certification on the airline, meaning the airline was unable to start its planned new routes to Faro in Portugal and Cebu in the Philippines, and also, of course, gave credence to the media's narrative. Ultimately, though, the FAA safety probe ended in November with the agency identifying no internal safety issues. On March 14th, SpaceX's Starship took to the skies for the first time in 4 months to complete its 3rd test flight. The spacecraft is a massive 2-stage, fully reusable launch vehicle, and this flight took place with 17 changes to the rocket following an FAA investigation into the spacecraft's 2nd flight, including overhauls of the ship's navigational and hydraulic systems to boost performance. The rocket took off from Boca Chica, Texas, and remained in flight for 49 minutes. Starship's 33 engines successfully ignited, and the spacecraft successfully separated, although a filter blockage of liquid oxygen caused 6 engines to fail, leading to the destruction of Starship's booster mid-flight. Nevertheless, as this was the first time Starship reached its targeted suborbital velocity, this was the first test flight deemed a success. When fully operational, the Starship launch system is expected to dramatically lower the cost of access to space through its tremendous economies of scale, and is a crucial component of the company's goal of reaching Mars, so this first successful test marked a major milestone in the process of unlocking the next era of space access and exploration. On March 22nd, Boom Supersonic conducted the first successful test flight of their XB-1 demonstrator aircraft, which they say will be, quote, the world's first independently developed supersonic jet. It reached a top speed of 273 miles or 439 kilometers per hour in 12 quick minutes of flight. This was just the first of a number of test flights the company conducted this year at the Mojave Air and Spaceport, and March's flight was the first instance of a non-military supersonic aircraft flying in US airspace in 20 years, last done by Concorde, even if it didn't yet reach supersonic speeds. Developing and successfully flying this single-seat jet is a crucial step in Boom's goal of introducing its 80-seat commercial supersonic aircraft, Overture, to the skies by 2029. After completing 10 subsonic aircraft tests, Boom is expected to begin breaching the sound barrier, and they've already secured the first ever special flight authorization to exceed Mach 1 from the FAA. Although their market viability remains to be seen, they're getting quite close to proving, at the very least, their capability of physically developing a supersonic airliner. On May 19th, a Bell 212 helicopter carrying the Iranian president Ebrahim Raisi crashed near the town of Uzi-Iran on the Azerbaijan border, killing him and the 7 other passengers aboard, including 3 additional dignitaries. The party was en route from a hydroelectric dam opening ceremony at Giz-Galasi to the city of Tabriz in the East Azerbaijan province when they hit heavy fog and clouds. The 2 other helicopters that were traveling as part of the convoy were able to fly above the weather, but immediately noticed when Raisi's helicopter didn't reappear. Because of the weather, it took 17 hours for recovery efforts to locate the helicopter in the dense wildlife corridor in which it fell. In fact, a Turkish Bayraktar Akinci uncrewed aerial vehicle, or a drone, was flown in to search for the crash that evening, several hours after the disappearance since Iran's advanced drones were already deployed to the Red Sea. Its flight was tracked by nearly 3 million people on Flight Radar 24, and when the UAV returned, it drew a crescent and star over Lake Van in Turkey, much to the displeasure of Iranian officials who were already disgruntled that it had flown over sensitive areas. The following day, May 20th, Singapore Airlines Flight 321 flew just north of Iran on its way from London to Singapore, but it later hit clear air turbulence over Myanmar, injuring 70 passengers and killing 1. This marked the first death directly attributed to turbulence since 1997, when a passenger died en route to Hawaii. The Singapore Airlines flight was about 10 hours into the 13-hour trip when the Boeing 777 experienced rapid vertical force changes and dropped 187 feet or 62 meters. The captain took over manual control and returned the plane to its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet and then diverted for an emergency landing in Bangkok. Though deaths from turbulence have always been and still are exceedingly rare, turbulence itself is becoming more common as the Earth's temperature warms. One study found that severe turbulence increased 55% between 1979 and 2020 on a typical North Atlantic route, one of the most turbulent corridors on the planet. Clear air turbulence is just one of 7 major types of turbulence, with the rest more closely associated with weather and geography, such as flying over a mountain range or hitting a thunderstorm. These kinds of turbulence are easier to predict and either prepare for or avert. But clear air turbulence, the type hit by this Singapore Airlines flight, is, as its name implies, almost invisible, making it difficult for pilots to know to turn the seatbelt signs on. On June 26, a small 37-seat Dash 8 plane landed in the Nunavummiut capital of Iqaluit, marking the first commercial flight connecting it to Greenland's capital of Nuuk since 2014. Although less than 2 hours, 500 miles, or 800 kilometers apart from each other by plane, these 2 Arctic capitals have long been days apart. The journey previously involved at least 28 hours, wherein travelers had to fly from Nuuk to Reykjavik to Toronto to Ottawa to finally board a plane to Iqaluit. Much of the population of both northern Canada and Greenland are Inuit, meaning they share a common heritage and history, so this first flight between the 2 capitals followed a 2022 intergovernmental agreement between Greenland and Nunavut, pledging to strengthen the relationship and develop cooperation, particularly in travel, tourism, and culture. Air Greenland, the operator of the flights, indicated their goal for these June to October flights was a 50% average load factor. Encouragingly, when the season ended, the airline revealed they'd averaged 70% of seats filled, even in spite of a brief suspension in operations in August due to an issue with Nuuk Airport's international flight authorization. These are strong signs for newly announced United and SAS flights to Greenland's capital for summer 2025, marking a major increase in inbound capacity to the previously isolated island. On June 12th, Qantas flew its inaugural 17-hour nonstop flight from Perth to Paris, also marking the first time the French capital was connected directly to the Australian continent by plane. While not the first Europe to Australia nonstop, that's existed for a couple of years from London, this flight marked the latest evolution in the way Qantas serves its massive yet far-flung European market. Qantas has flown to Europe since as far back as 1947, first reaching London in a Lockheed Constellation that stopped in Darwin, Singapore, Calcutta, Karachi, Cairo, and Tripoli, with tickets that cost an inflation-adjusted $90,000. In the latter half of the century, the airline had developed a rather extensive European network, flying one-stop service not only to London, but also Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Paris, Rome, and more, as despite the tremendous distance, the cultural connections meant that Australians traveled to Europe quite a lot, and vice versa. But then came the rise of the Middle Eastern Three: Emirates, Qatar, and Etihad. Perfectly situated in the natural connection point between Australia and Europe, these airlines took tremendous market share from Qantas, offering one-stop service not only to major European and Australian destinations, but essentially every decently sized city on each continent. And not only were they more convenient, they were cheaper too, meaning Qantas just couldn't effectively compete. Through the years, the airline pared back its European service to eventually just one route to London via Dubai. But then came Project Sunrise. Formally announced in 2017, the airline pledged to launch non-stop flights from the highly populated east coast of Australia to Europe and New York as soon as Boeing or Airbus provided an aircraft capable of doing so. And as a first step, they launched non-stop flights from the closer but less populated west coast, with its inaugural Perth to London flight taking place in early 2018. This flight was successful, as it seemed that whether it be the comfort of connecting in one's own country, the convenience of one short flight followed by one super long one rather than two long ones, or something else, Australians were willing to pay more to fly to London via Perth than via Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Doha on the competing airlines. So Qantas has gotten more aggressive. They want to develop the market and change travel patterns ahead of the launch of the 22-hour Project Sunrise flights, now expected in 2026. A big part of this is by flying not only to the top European destination, London, but also to other major European cities. This route network evolution first took place through the addition of seasonal flights to Rome during the European summer, and the Paris flight was the latest addition. Unlike the Rome flight, the Paris flight is operating year-round, so this marks a major step towards a return to the third oldest airline's heyday of super long-haul European operations. But Qantas certainly does not suffer from competition on its short-haul routes, especially now as Australia's Regional Express, aka Rex, flew its last 737 flight on July 30th from Sydney to Melbourne. The failure of its 737 operations, which spanned these 8 routes, reflects Rex's larger financial struggles operating in Australia's challenging market. While facing a different set of challenges than Canada, Australia too has struggled to maintain any real competitor to its duopoly, Qantas and Virgin Australia. Rex was historically a regional airline focused on Saab 340 operations to small, remote communities in eastern and southern Australia, which proved a solid business model and helped grow the airline to the country's third largest. Although it yielded slower, incremental profit growth, their near monopoly on these routes ensured consistent returns. But in 2020, they decided to incorporate 10 737s into their fleet to operate on Australia's bigger intercity markets, a risky gamble that never paid off. These intercity routes were already served by Qantas and Virgin, and seemingly Rex didn't do enough to differentiate. They weren't cheap enough to draw budget travelers, nor frequent enough to draw business travelers. Over 4 years, Rex's 737 routes lost them $1 million per week, while only drawing 9% of their targeted market share. Rex isn't the first Australian airline to run into financial issues this year. Bonza, which focused on low-cost, low-frequency routes for the 15 months it existed, went under in April. Government officials have agreed to loan Rex the funds necessary to continue its regional routes, but Australia has a bigger problem. Virgin Australia and Qantas function as a duopoly and have little incentive to lower prices or provide better service. The two control over 90% of the market, while Rex's modest successes had been in monopolizing regional markets that Qantas and Virgin didn't bother with. Low-cost carriers haven't been able to meaningfully compete with these airlines, as wave after wave of budget air carriers have failed in the Australian market. Some politicians have proposed designating specific gates for different carriers at Sydney's airport to help smaller competitors, while others have proposed splitting Qantas into 2 companies between its titular airline and its budget brand, Jetstar. On the 1st of August, the last of 7 planes from these countries descended upon Ankara Esenboga Airport in Turkey to facilitate the largest prisoner exchange between the US and Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. Encompassing a Russian Special Flight Squadron and a fleet of privately owned bombardiers originating from these cities throughout the US and Europe, this coordination of aircraft resulted from 2 years of negotiations to free European and American civilians imprisoned in Russia. These flights reflected a global partnership of private air carriers and individuals with big enough planes that wouldn't attract too much attention en route to Ankara before the prisoner exchange was announced publicly. In the past 2 decades, hostage diplomacy has been frequently used by Russia, China, and Iran, where they arrest and imprison foreign citizens under dubious circumstances to gain political leverage and compel the release of their own citizens. Evan Gershkovich, the first reporter working for an American outlet charged with espionage since the Cold War, was among the US prisoners freed more than 16 months after his initial detainment. One key release in negotiations was Vadim Kresikov, a Russian hitman who Germany agreed to release after he'd been convicted of murdering a Georgian citizen in 2019 in broad daylight. Although the prisoner exchange was a notable easing of tensions, it reflects a troubling diplomatic trend between Russia and the West. On August 9th, Vopass Flight 2283, traveling from Cascavel to Sao Paulo, Brazil, lost altitude and crashed, killing all 62 passengers and crew on board. CENIPA, Brazil's Center for Investigation and Prevention of Aviation Accidents, is investigating this crash over the next year to determine exactly what went wrong aboard, but according to Vopass and the initial investigation, we know that the ATR-72 plane took off from Cascavel without any flight restrictions and with all systems operational. But the aircraft had suffered from structural damage from a tail strike in March. After it returned to normal service, passengers complained that the air conditioning system wasn't working a month before the crash. The plane maintained altitude after its initial descent towards Sao Paulo, at which point it experienced significant ice buildup. After several error messages with the de-icing system, the pilots agreed to maintain altitude until they were cleared for landing, but lost control of the plane only 2 minutes after turning on the de-icing system. The troubles for Boeing this year unfortunately didn't end with the 737. On August 16th, it conducted an FAA certification test flight using one of the first 4 airframes of its new 777X model, flying for 5 hours and 31 minutes over the Pacific Ocean before returning to Kona Airport in Hawaii. All went as planned in the air, but upon return, a post-flight inspection found a severed thrust link, a critical part of the component that mounts the engine to the aircraft. While much of the design of this new model is based on previous 777 models, the thrust links are specific to the 777X due to its heavier and larger engines. And when inspectors looked at the other test airframes, WH-001 and WH-004, which were in Everett, Washington, and WH-002 at Boeing Field in Seattle, they found similar failures on the thrust links, indicating that it was more than an isolated incident. The 777X is mounted with 2 GE Aerospace GE9X power plants, each with 2 thrust links. The pieces are made of titanium and transfer loads from the engine to the lower parts of the engine mount, and because there are 4 on each plane, the redundancy means that even if one fails, the structure maintains integrity and the aircraft can safely land. FAA testing is, of course, the opportunity to root out issues before a new model gets approval. The plane, whose first test flight was over 4 years ago, could be the world's largest and most fuel-efficient twin-engine passenger jet if it's cleared for takeoff. Though the part has been replaced on WH-003, in October the company announced that its first 777X deliveries would now be delayed until 2026, which was just the latest delay from the original estimate of 2019. The announcement affected more than a dozen airlines that have orders with Boeing, most notably Emirates with some 205 777Xs expected. Sheikh Ahmad bin Saeed Al Maktoum, chairman and CEO of the airline, made a rare bit of public criticism of Boeing when he said, quote, "We're not happy really with what's going on. We always really wanted to see this aircraft entering the fleet when it had been promised, and there is a delay. It's not only to us." The spiral continued for Boeing as 33,000 Boeing employees went on an 8-week strike this fall in a fight over fair wages. As a result of the strike, which stopped production on 737s, 767s, and 777s, Boeing also cut 17,000 jobs, representing about 10% of its global workforce. The problems continue to mount. The company reported $5 billion in losses in its third quarter, and it's hard to predict how a company that continues to have blowout events can ever land safely at this current speed. And even though the strike ended and negotiations were settled, it continued to be a bad year for Boeing. It was supposed to be a bright spot when Boeing's Starliner spacecraft successfully landed at 12:01 a.m. at the US Army's White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico after an extended stay at the International Space Station. But it was missing something important: the 2 astronauts who initially were aboard when it launched in June. That's because what was scheduled to be a 10-day trip for Sonny Williams and Butch Wilmore, making history as the first crewed Boeing Starliner flight, already after years of issues and delays, quickly turned into an odyssey when helium leaks and issues with the Starliner's reaction control thrusters were discovered as it approached the space station. The astronauts and technicians on the ground tried to find solutions for the spacecraft, but it became apparent that a quick fix, and one that NASA felt confident with to carry the astronauts back to Earth, would not be found. Instead, the organization opted to send the Starliner back to Earth uncrewed in September and leave Williams and Wilmore at the space station until a SpaceX Crew 9 spacecraft can bring them home in February, extending their trip by 9 months. Obviously, the unplanned stay in space is an issue for the agency and the astronauts, but getting them home safely is the priority. The fact that NASA didn't think the Boeing craft could do it adds mounting doubt to their already crumbling reputation. Canada's northernmost city of just 7,000 people got a surprise visit when Air India Flight 127 made an emergency landing in Iqaluit with 211 passengers after it received a bomb threat. The stranded passengers, originally en route from Delhi to Chicago, stayed in the tiny town where the airstrip was first constructed by the United States during World War II for 17 hours before receiving a ride from a Royal Canadian Air Force Airbus A330 to finish the journey. The town lacked the resources to support that many travelers, and it didn't have an explosives detectives unit to quickly search the plane and assure the threat was unfounded. Ultimately it was, and was just one of more than 500 bomb threats that specifically plagued Indian flights in October. In fact, on October 29th, more than 100 threats were made in one day. The threats have since tapered off, but authorities are still investigating who made them and why. India is one of the fastest growing commercial aviation markets in the world. 150 million domestic passengers flew in 2023, and the hoaxes wreaked havoc on a system that's already maxed out with flight delays and cancellations that ultimately cost the airlines millions. On October 26th, the last ever Czech Airlines flight took its final journey from Paris to Prague under the code OK761, landing at 4:58 p.m. and bringing a century-old airline to a close. Begun in 1923 under the name Czechoslovak State Airlines, they provided domestic flights between Bratislava and Prague and expanded to Zagreb in 1930. In fact, it was the fifth oldest airline in the world to still operate and reached a vaunted status with these four airlines. After expanding to long-haul flights in the 1970s, Czech Airlines persisted through financial troubles in the 1990s and 2000s, the former of which spurred by unsuccessfully trying to privatize, and the latter by the 2008 financial crisis, as well as increasing competition. 98% of Czech Airlines' shares were purchased in 2018 by Smartwings, who took over its existing routes and aircraft. Czech Airlines' only route for the past few years has been between Prague and Paris, which is also served by a plethora of low-cost carriers like EasyJet and Ryanair. Czech Airlines branded Airbuses will still fly under Smartwings' name, but those planes will be the only traces in the sky left of the once lauded airline. On November 14th, the world's first commercially operated Airbus A321XLR took to the skies for its first transatlantic flight, flying from Madrid to Boston with the moniker ECOIL. Operated by Iberia Airlines, this plane is much anticipated. The largest single-aisle jet currently in production, with a maximum range of 5,400 miles or 8,700 kilometers or 11 hours non-stop. The XLR moniker refers to its extra-long range and reflects Airbus's entry into a market previously served by the now discontinued Boeing 757 and larger wide-body aircraft. The route from Madrid to Boston is a smaller demand route offered by Iberia, whose economics would prove challenging operating year-round on a wide-body jet. But because this jet is a middle-of-the-road, single-aisle aircraft whose range punches above its weight, Iberia can make this route work with fewer passengers per flight. Iberia will expand its A321XLR service to its Madrid to DC route beginning in January, and other airlines have put in over 500 orders for the model already. Within a number of years, this aircraft should make for plenty more transatlantic nonstops between destinations previously too low demand to justify long-haul flights. ECOIL's first flight from Madrid to Boston also ups the stakes for Boeing, whose regulatory problems aren't limited to door plugs flying off planes mid-flight. Their largest single aisle, the 737 MAX 10, has yet to pass certification. And on November 26th, the last regular Air Greenland A330 flight from Copenhagen to Kangerlussuaq Airport in Greenland occurred. This has been the primary way in and out of Greenland for decades, but that ended as the flights to Copenhagen shifted to the country's capital, Nuuk, following the opening of its new airport on November 28th. It's the end of a long era for Kangerlussuaq. This airport, located 50 miles or 80 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, was Greenland's biggest commercial airport and primary air traffic hub after it was originally built as a US air base during World War II. Until this year, it was the only airport in southern Greenland with a long enough runway to accept wide-body planes. Kangerlussuaq's location was a double-edged sword. Because it sits inland, it has relatively mild weather and better visibility, but it's also quite remote with a population of 500. In fact, the town was basically built to house personnel for the airport. As Greenland's tourism grew over the past 30 years, Kangerlussuaq became a sticking point. Any jet aircraft, meaning almost any international flight, had to land here, hundreds of miles north of Nuuk. That meant most international travelers had to transfer to smaller planes to get to Nuuk or other coastal population centers. In 2011, Air Greenland decided to move its intercontinental hub from Kangerlussuaq after a runway extension in Nuuk was completed. 13 years later, that runway extension is done along with a brand new terminal, part of the Danish government's investment in Greenland tourism infrastructure. While November 26th marked the end of Airbus A330s flying to Kangerlussuaq, the fjord-adjacent hamlet will continue to be a draw for tourists coming by sea, as it remains a large cruise port for those passing through. If you're the kind of person who likes watching Wendover, you clearly like getting into the details of anything. I'm guessing that the same goes for when you make a big purchase. You do plenty of research into the meticulous details of what you're buying and read plenty of reviews before spending your money, as you should. But that means you should also be doing the same with charitable giving. As I'm sure you know, the effectiveness of nonprofits varies widely, and it's not always easy to figure out which ones are effective and which are not. But that's the problem our sponsor, GiveWell, is trying to solve. They've spent 17 years researching philanthropic opportunities and direct you to a small number of the highest impact opportunities they found so that your money makes a big difference. Over 125,000 donors have donated over $2 billion through GiveWell, which rigorous evidence suggests has saved over 200,000 lives. For example, it only costs about $2 to deliver vitamin A supplements to a child in need. Since vitamin A deficiency can increase mortality rates, systematic vitamin A distributions can certainly save lives. GiveWell itself is a nonprofit, so they offer all this research to you for free. Their mission is to help donors give most effectively, and that's it. They don't take a cut or anything with what you give, and it's all tax deductible. In fact, if you've never used GiveWell before, they'll even match your donation up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org, pick YouTube, and enter Wendover at checkout.